If you are in a school that's implementing Ci3T, the members of your Ci3T leadership team are coming together multiple times a year to connect on things like screening, like treatment integrity and social validity. And these Empower sessions are open to them, but they're also open to anyone else who's interested in learning more about the pieces of Ci3T and how this model can serve as a foundation for all of the different things that are happening in your school. And when we think about all of the things that are happening right now, we truly want to just say thank you for your commitment to meeting students' multiple needs. Pre-pandemic, we knew that about 12 to 20% of students struggled with some type of behavior challenge, but less than 1% of students actually receive special education services for emotional and behavior disorders, which means that the vast majority of those students who are struggling are present in general education classrooms. And screening gives us a specific way of looking for students who are struggling with both internalizing and externalizing challenges. And Ci3T helps us shift to a systems level perspective of thinking about and supporting these students wherever they are. So Ci3T is not something that just popped up overnight. It started many years ago in California, and members of our team who have been here for far longer than I have had the opportunity and really the pleasure to work with different schools and districts in all kinds of different places to get to where we are now. And some of you here tonight might be participating in one of our projects called Project Enhance, where we have the opportunity to work with several districts and schools as they're implementing Ci3T. And tonight, we are talking specifically and interacting with the traditional materials available for Ci3T. So let's dive in a little bit. In a Ci3T model, there are three main domains. So you have academics, where you're using validated curriculum to support students. You have your behavioral domain, where the core component is implementing PBIS, which is positive behavioral interventions and supports. So you're doing things like explicitly teaching students the expectations, and you're acknowledging them when they meet those expectations. And then you have your social domain, where you're using a validated curriculum so that all students are receiving support in that area. And all of these pieces are implemented across three tiers. So at tier 1, or what we sometimes refer to as primary prevention, every student, just by the nature of being in the building, receives these supports. We usually anticipate about 80% of students respond to the work that's being done at this level. And then at tier 2, or secondary prevention, as Kathleen says all the time, tier 2 is not a tragedy, it's an expectation. We know that some students are going to need a little bit more support in some areas, and that's okay. We have a plan in place for responding to and supporting them. And we would usually anticipate about 10 to 15% of students needing some type of extra support. And these could be across the domain, so academic, behavior, or social. And they can be things like acquisition problems, so something that a student can't do, fluency problems, which is something that they are just having trouble doing, or performance problems, meaning that they can do it, they just aren't doing it. And then when we think about tier 3 or tertiary prevention, we would anticipate about 5 to 7% of students needing this kind of most intensive, more individualized support. So things that you might see here, like a functional assessment done to support a student. So at tier 1, we have high quality instruction happening to support academics. And then we also have PBIS in place. And along with that comes a school-wide expectation matrix. So if you're in a school implementing Ci3T, this is built with input from your faculty and staff to see what behaviors that they thought were most important to see in those different settings. And again, we're being really intentional about how we are defining these expectations, how we're teaching them to students. This matrix isn't just something that sits in the back of a classroom, it's something that can be used as a teaching tool in all areas of the building. And then we have our social skills curriculum. that is selected to teach. So your Ci3T leadership team members, when they were going through that building process, they went through a process to select a validated curriculum to fit the needs of your school and your community. And these things all being taught at Tier 1 really helps us level the playing field so that every kid gets instruction on figuring out how to do things like set a goal or how to be self-aware or how to self-regulate when things are really not going well. And these are skills that we want kids to know and to practice now while they're in school, but we also want them to have these skills when they leave school and when they start living and working and becoming active members of the communities that we're in. And all of these things are happening as part of Ci3T. So at Tier 1, every student that is entering the building has access to all of those. And there's clarity for all stakeholders, for your students, your faculty and staff, your administrators and your families about what is taking place. Because in your school Ci3 implementation manual, the practicalities of how to do all these things are outlined there. So if you have a Ci3T implementation manual for your school, this slide might look familiar to you. There's a section about roles and responsibilities where information about academics, behavior, and social instruction are provided. You might see things like low intensity strategies that can be used by teachers to help minimize disruption and increase engagement. Things like pre-correction or active supervision that every adult in the building can use when they're interacting with students. You might also see things about responding respectfully in a positive manner when students are starting to struggle in class, or resources or things about using the reactive plan when challenges do occur. And then if you look in that manual, you'll also probably find information about how often and when you're supposed to teach the lessons from that social skills curriculum. So is there something, is that something that's done weekly at morning meetings? Is there a designated time in the afternoons where those lessons are supposed to be taught? All of that information about how those things are being done is available in your Ci3T implementation manual. And that includes things like procedures for teaching. So how are stakeholders going to know what's expected of them? Good news, there's information about that in the manual. We have to teach people the plan so that they know what to do. And then we also want to think about the procedures that are in place for reinforcing. How are we going to acknowledge not just students, but also faculty and staff and families too for implementing the components of that plan? And then we also have a plan for monitoring the things that are happening. How are we checking in on students across those three domains? And how are we making sure that the things that we want in place are actually happening? And collecting and using systematic screening data is part of that monitoring component. So as we think about those domains, academic, behavior, and social, a helpful tool to use might be this integrated lesson plan. We are not suggesting that teachers fill this out for every lesson, but it can be a helpful way to frame a lesson. So it allows you to intentionally plan for integration within a lesson. So how can the social skills that you are teaching also be weaved into this lesson? And the same thing with behavior expectations. And then there's also that section on the side about low intensity strategies. So as you're planning, you can think about which strategies you might be able to use to help students stay engaged during the lesson. And so when we think about monitoring in a Ci3T plan, there are a few components that we want to keep in mind and that we want to collect information on. So social validity is how people are feeling about what's going on. Treatment integrity is the extent to which the plan is being put in place as intended. And in a Ci3T model, you're collecting information from faculty and staff twice a year in fall and in spring to see how those things are going. And this is important because we're going to talk in a little bit about connecting students to Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, but we don't want to tell people that a student needs more than Tier 1 has to offer if we're not even sure that Tier 1 is in place in the first place. And then we have screening data that's collected. So behavior screening happens 3 times a year in fall, winter, and spring. And it gives you an opportunity to systematically look for kids to see what's going on. And then you can use that information in conjunction with other sources of data like treatment integrity data, like attendance, math scores, reading scores, office discipline referrals, to connect students to Tier 2 supports. In your implementation manuals, you have a list of intervention grids that show you what's available in your school to support students at Tier 2 and also at Tier 3. So the good news is that you don't have to guess which students might need what, because you are checking in, you're using data that you're collecting to make decisions so that students aren't inadvertently getting overlooked. So in just a second, Mark is going to talk us through a little bit more specifically about kind of collecting that data and then using it to support students across Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So Mark, I'm going to hand it to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. That was a great overview of Ci3T and kind of a little teaser for what we'll be talking about for the rest of the evening, which is, of course, as Rebecca mentioned, systematic screening. I believe you all can see my PowerPoint now, so let me just get it set up on my side. Okay, so as we move through the next couple of blocks, we're going to be talking and going deep into some different ways that systematic behavior screening data can be used. There are some obvious use cases for these data, and then there are some maybe slightly less obvious ways to interpret them, as well as some pitfalls that people sometimes fall into and alternative paths that we can use to really get the most out of having access to this information. So we're going to kind of take a careful look specifically across 3 areas. We'll talk about how these data can be used to inform instruction at Tier 1 and kind of evaluate how that Tier 1 experience is working for students across the school. Then we're going to talk about some potential pathways to addressing if you're seeing school-wide data or class-wide data where you find a lot of kids are at risk for internalizing behaviors or externalizing behaviors or potentially both. There's a temptation to jump straight to Tier 2 and Tier 3. However, there's actually some steps that you might want to take in between starting those more intensive interventions where we're actually going to think about how to intensify Tier 1 to make sure that we're being responsive to what needs are manifesting themselves in our school or classroom. So we'll look at that in terms of empowering teachers by using low intensity supports to do that intensification of Tier 1. And then lastly, we'll get to the use case, of course, of actually connecting kids to Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports when their data indicate that that's necessary. Before we head into those individual sections, though, we're going to just kind of give a broad overview of screening itself, as well as point you in the direction of some really useful resources that are available to you. So, of course, we are going to point you to ci3t.org. We have a tab called Systematic Screening that you'll find up at that black toolbar on top of the website. If you click that, you'll find a host of really useful resources that you can use, especially if your school is exploring screening as a possibility, but also if your school is actively screening right now. There are some very handy resources that are available there. So we encourage you to pull up that tab of the website at this time, just to kind of get yourself there, and we'll reference a couple of things throughout the evening as we're moving through the content here. Before we move on to, I'm about to talk about an individual behavior screening tool called the Student Risk Screening Scale for internalizing and externalizing behaviors. I do want to say that that is not the only screening tool that's available. So if you are in a position where you're exploring screening as a practice in your district, we have a couple of tools that summarize local screeners. So yeah, we are going to focus on that tool, the SRSS-IE, but do know that that's not the only one out there. Okay, and speaking of the SRSS-IE, Student Risk Screening Scale for Internalizing and Externalizing, this is a screener that is widely used by a lot of schools that are implementing Ci3T. It is not the only screener that's used by schools implementing Ci3T, but a lot of folks do choose this one because it is free to use, and you can actually download the tool itself from that tab that I just mentioned before, the Systematic Screening tab of the website. It is extremely efficient to use. You can generally rate an entire class of students in about 15 minutes. And there are some really good data available that suggests that this tool is as accurate as many commercially available tools for identifying students who are likely to experience not just behavioral difficulty, but also academic difficulty. And we'll unpack a little bit of those data later if you're interested in kind of seeing what some of the evidence is to suggest that this tool is helpful for identifying those students who are at risk. So yeah, this tool is available on the website. And if you were to download it, you would basically find an Excel sheet that gives the items that are rated. And if you were doing this for your own class or at your own school and just kind of getting this up off the ground, you could actually just populate this Excel spreadsheet and go ahead and screen to get this information. It actually calculates the risk categories for you automatically. So if you're interested in kind of exploring screening, that is a tool available for you. However, we do always encourage people not to just go and screen until you actually have a plan to do something with the data. It's generally not a good practice to identify or locate students that may have behavioral difficulties unless you have some systematic plan to address those difficulties, which we're going to be going into detail about what that might look like tonight. But generally, yeah, having some plan to intervene is a necessary prerequisite before actually collecting this information. So when we think about the SRSS-IE, it's good to know that those two major things that it measures are internalizing and externalizing. So this is a table that shows the cut scores for the measure. The SRSS-E7 are 7 original items that are used to rate externalizing behaviors. And in elementary school, scores of 0 to 3 indicate a student is at low risk, 4 to 8 indicate moderate risk, and 9 to 21 indicate high risk. The I5 are 5 additional items that are used to rate internalizing behaviors. These items, you'll notice, have cut scores that are a little bit lower, which suggests that students that have even a small amount of risk here could be actually at moderate or have a relatively low score on this factor and may actually be at moderate risk relatively quickly. So good to know that that it doesn't take a whole lot of concern for those internalizing behaviors to become something that we want to really consider possibly looking at interventions to support those students. On the right side of the screen, let me just click through here. On the right side, you'll find that middle school and high school have slightly different cut scores. The reason being that one item that for elementary school is exclusively for externalizing behaviors, the item is called peer rejection, actually factors both into externalizing and internalizing on the middle school level. So the cut scores are a little bit different for the secondary age students, but the same essential information is pulled out of that measure where we can identify students who are at low, moderate, or high risk across externalizing and internalizing behaviors. As we think about what those data might look like if we were to collect them for an entire school, we actually have some resources available on our website that can be used to summarize the percentage of students at low, moderate, and high risk. So this is an example of what that might look like over time. And how interesting and useful is this to be able to look at sort of this longitudinal journey of a single school as we look through the years and can see how risk might shift within that school over time. So these are the externalizing scores for actually a real school. Kind of interesting to see, a pretty high degree of moderate and high risk for externalizing behaviors, a little bit different in the fall of 2020, which was actually this is when students were coming back after school closures when COVID initially took place. So kind of actually looked like things were a little bit better. Also worth noting that a lot of schools had smaller class sizes, a lot of different procedures in place that might have made their actual school risk look a little bit different. But actually, even as students were kind of getting back to a little bit more normalcy in the fall of 2021, risk was looking a little bit better in the school over time. Really interesting. And we'll kind of return to some possible interpretations for those data. And here you can find the similar kind of information for internalizing behavior, where you can kind of look at a school's journey over time and see how risk might be shifting. Another way that we can look at the information is actually broken down by grade level. And again, as we start talking about interpretations, this can start being super helpful too, because even if we look at the school-wide level, maybe there's a little bit more information to unpack, because you might look and say, actually, when you look at this particular example, it looks like kindergarten is just really in good shape with relatively low levels of risk across externalizing behaviors. But then second grade, you can see that the distribution is a little bit different. It still looks pretty good, but there are definitely more students who are having those moderate levels of difficulty with externalizing behaviors. And as we're thinking about either at the classroom level, so if I'm a teacher, knowing that about my grade level is kind of helpful because it starts letting me think about how to inform my tier 1 instruction, or at the school level too, to say, hey, what supports can we push in for those grade levels that might have different levels of risk? And again, as we think about interpretation, we'll come back to that in a moment. Before we get kind of into the actual use of the information, this may be of very great interest to some of you and maybe a little bit less so to others. So I won't go too deep into the analysis that are used. But if you ever have questions about like, what does the research say about the use of this measure? How accurate is it for figuring out who might be at risk for academic or behavioral difficulties? We actually have some really good data to show exactly what that looks like. So what you're looking at here is it's called a predictive validity study. We were looking at the degree to which externalizing risk for elementary students predicted not just behavioral outcomes, but academic outcomes as well. So basically what this is going to tell us is that students that were at low risk were significantly higher in oral reading fluency at the end of the year. So let me clarify one thing. This is students who are at low risk at the beginning of the school year. So we're using beginning of the school year risk to predict end of year academic and behavioral outcomes. So kids that were at low risk at the beginning of the year had significantly higher rates of oral reading fluency at the end of the year as compared to students in the moderate risk level and the high risk level. And as kids had higher risk, they had lower and lower levels of oral reading fluency, which is really interesting to know. Like, behavioral risk is definitely potentially impacting their academic performance. And we actually find the same thing on MAP reading scores, which is another way that we can assess reading ability. Kids who had low levels of externalizing behavior at the beginning of the year had higher MAP scores than kids in the moderate or high risk level. And again, the higher the risk, the lower the scores. For externalizing behaviors, we also find something similar with in-school suspensions. Kids, of course, that have higher levels of externalizing risk are going to have greater levels of discipline referrals. And actually, interestingly enough, they go to the nurse more often as well. So as we think about what all this means, it's basically saying if we find kids at the beginning of the year that are at moderate or high risk, we really need to use that information to start making plans to address those challenges, because it's likely that risk is going to impact end of year outcomes. And again, not just behaviorally, but academically as well, which really makes the case for the use of an integrated model like Ci3T, where we're not just looking at academic performance by itself or behavioral performance by itself, but trying to look across those domains. Makes it really, really an important way for us to think about how to support students, because behavioral risk is certainly going to impact academic performance. We want to make sure that we're pushing in supports for both of their needs and not just trying to remediate academics without addressing behavioral challenge or vice versa. So that's externalizing behavior. But one of the true benefits of a screener like the SRSS-IE is that we're looking for internalizing risk as well. Internalizing behaviors are things like being shy, anxious, or withdrawn. These are kids that are typically missed when we only use things like office discipline referrals to find students who might need tier 2 or tier 3 supports. And that's a real concern, especially when you look at some of the data on this predictive validity study that we did for elementary students. So basically what we found was that students who had low risk for internalizing behaviors at the beginning of the year scored significantly higher than students who had high internalizing risk at the end of the year on oral reading fluency. So basically what this is telling us is that high risk for internalizing behaviors may put students at risk for lower academic performance as well. And that's true for reading. And we also found that students with internalizing risk had significantly more nurse visits than students with low risk. Again, students that have internalizing concerns will often make somatic complaints, which is like complaints about maybe feeling sick to their stomach or having pains. And oftentimes those complaints result in the students going to the nurse's office. And when they're going to the nurse's office, they're missing instruction. So you can kind of see there's a pathway where these internalizing behaviors might actually interfere with access to instruction and learning as well. And even students with internalizing concerns had higher risk for in-school suspensions as well. And those might be students that are having sort of those comorbid internalizing and externalizing concerns. But definitely worth noting that internalizing is certainly having an impact on the end of year outcomes for students as well. And so we can't just be preoccupied with externalizing behaviors. We do need to think about how to support those students with internalizing concerns as well. So At the middle school level, we actually found pretty similar results. For a similar predictability study, we found that, whoops, I thought I was going to summarize that for me. Very similarly, the higher the risk for externalizing behaviors, the lower you find students are in terms of GPA. So academic performance is certainly being impacted as well, but particularly around office discipline referrals and in-school suspensions, higher levels of risk are going to be predicting higher levels of discipline referral and suspensions, as well as course failures. And so definitely at the secondary level, we need to be mindful of those externalizing behaviors as well. And so these data can be looked at the school level. And as we're thinking about doing things like evaluating how our programs are working at the secondary schools, for example, having an idea of the distribution of risk is super helpful because we do know that these behaviors might be impacting academic performance. So it's helpful to kind of look at the distributions of low, moderate, and high risk at the secondary level as well. And kind of looking at those data over time to see how our programs are doing to support students. Are we shifting risk over time? And then as we're thinking about these data, we can't just have them be something that leadership teams are looking at. So, and we're so happy to have you guys here at this session, which is really focused on the classroom teachers and folks that are actually working and collecting these data, because we want to make sure that these data get back to you all so that you see what your leadership teams are looking at and also have a chance to work with them directly. So as we're thinking about interpretation, I think that some of the content later tonight is going to be super helpful for you. So again, those data can be summarized at the middle school level, and hopefully your Ci3T leadership teams are having opportunities to share these data back with you, possibly in like faculty and staff meetings where you get a chance to look at how is the school doing as a whole and what are our different grade levels looking like in terms of behavioral risk. So again, breaking those data down at the school-wide level, the grade or department level is super helpful, and eventually also getting a chance to look at the data for your individual class. So you can start looking through and saying, what does the risk look like across my class, and how do we start making an impact on those students' behavioral challenges potentially? The next piece to kind of think about here is maybe hopefully not feeling quite as relevant now, but definitely something that's still possibly in the back of our minds. During the period of COVID-19 school closures and the ways that COVID impacted schools, there were a lot of questions around how to use systematic screening during that time. If you are a virtual teacher, or if you still have questions about how screening was functioning during the COVID era, we have some resources on our website about that topic that you certainly could check out. To talk about just some guidance for how screening was done during remote learning, and potentially some guidelines for collecting data or things to avoid or things to keep in mind during that unique period in time. But then also, this is probably a little bit more useful generally. We have an ebook that's called the Screening Coordinator Training Manual. If you're in a district that is thinking about adopting screening, or if you're kind of just exploring the possibility, this is actually a document that's going to explain how to set up screening in your school or district, which is super helpful for getting a sense of what does it actually look like to get this off the ground in my school or district. So if you're in that position where you're kind of like testing the waters for screening, that's a document that we would highly recommend, and we can certainly point you in that direction tonight as we move forward. So we're going to stop here and do a quick conversation. And Katie, you can tell us if we're going to go to breakout rooms or stay here in just a moment. But this conversation is going to focus on, from this initial broad overview of screening and from your experiences that you've had screening in your schools, what are some potential benefits of using that screening data to figure out which students are at risk? And what are some potential challenges or questions that you might have? All right, so now that we've done sort of the big picture on screening, let's jump into the actual interpretation of those data. So the first thing we're going to look at is just how it can be used to look at the functioning of Tier 1 instruction, particularly at the school-wide level. So I'm going to show you some data that come from, this is not the SRSS-IE, this is something called the Social Skills Improvement System Performance Screening Guide. It's another kind of screener. It includes information on reading skills, math skills, pro-social behavior, and motivation to learn. So this is actually kind of a strengths-based type screening tool, which again has some really useful information. And as we kind of look at what these data are telling us, you can see that across these different domains, the green, which is our students that are at low risk, is fairly small in proportion to the school as a whole. So across the board, we're sort of somewhere between like 40 and 56% of students at that low risk level. And then we go up to the sort of Tier 2 or moderate risk level, and we can see we've got upwards of like a third to half of the students at some level of risk. And again, a fairly sizable portion of students at high risk. So in looking at these data, they sort of provide an illustration of an idea that is on one hand very intuitive, but on the other hand can be kind of hard to wrap one's head around fully, which is that when we're thinking about our 3-tiered setup here, where we're giving tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, when we find kids with risk, it doesn't necessarily make sense to jump straight in and give everybody that has risk tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. And the reason for that becomes evident as soon as you start thinking about the actual numbers involved. If you look across your school and you find that you've got, 50% of kids that are struggling on math skills, there's no way that you have enough resources to provide tier 2 and tier 3 instruction to all of those students. That's one thing. And it's a sort of I'll call it an economic reality, but you can call it a human resources reality. There's just not enough people or money to do that. But then even a step back from that, if we're looking at how our core instruction is functioning, if core instruction is still resulting in that number of students at risk for math skills, for example, we know that we need to think about ways we can change our instruction, right? It's not enough to just do intervention. If the tier 1 dose isn't doing what it needs to do, we've got to really think about what does tier 1 consist of and how can we make it better to support our students' needs in that skill. I think in terms of academic skills, that makes a lot of sense. But suddenly when we apply that to behavioral skills, there's sort of another tendency to be like, oh, we've got to do all these tier 2 interventions. We need to give check-in, check-out to half of our school because they have high levels of externalizing need. But you run into the same type of difficulties where you just aren't going to have enough resources. And there are things that we might be able to do at tier 1 that are going to modify that experience. So this is how our screening data are going to start giving us some indication about interpreting how tier 1 is functioning across the school. So here's another example that's a little bit similar. This is internalizing risk across time. And as we look at these data, these are like the most recent internalizing data for this school. These data look a little bit better. Got 70% of kids at low risk, 16% of kids at moderate risk, and about 13% of kids at high risk. This looks a lot better. However, that's still a pretty high proportion of kids. It's about 30%, a third of the school that are having some risk for internalizing behaviors. And although we definitely want to start thinking about how we can support some of these students at tier 3 and at tier 2, it's a missed opportunity to also say, okay, is there some room for growth in our tier 1 experience? Is there something else that we can do for all students to start addressing some of the needs that are clearly very pervasive in our school? Again, because tier 1 is something that we want to impact every single student. Kids that have tier 3 needs and tier 2 needs are still getting tier 1. So those kids are there. Let's make sure the tier 1 dose does something for them as well. And hopefully by pushing some of those additional resources and supports in for all students, we can actually start to reduce the levels of risk at tier 2 and tier 3 as well. And then if you look at data like this, or this is data from a middle school from years ago, specifically about externalizing behaviors. You look at these data and they started kind of in a similar place to that last school. However, over time, the proportion of students at low risk just keeps going up and up and up. And by natural extension, the kids at moderate and high risk start reducing as well. This is great news. And it's telling us, hey, tier 1 is working really, really well. And by virtue of tier 1 serving the needs of so many students, we have the opportunity to do really excellent work at tiers 2 and tier 3 because the numbers are manageable and they give us kind of the flexibility and availability to really do those great resources. Now, all that said, your school's data do not have to look like this for you to be ready to move forward with tier 2 and tier 3. If you have that mindset that, we have to have 90% of needs met, you're going to be spending a lot of time kind of butting your head against the wall before you really are able to move forward to tier 2 and tier 3. So this is not necessarily the goal, but it does give you some indication for how that tier 1 experience is functioning for students, and using that as a lens first is really helpful. So then the question becomes, okay, if our data show that our distribution of risk is a little bit out of whack. We have a lot of kids at moderate and high risk for externalizing behaviors or internalizing behaviors, and not as many students as we would like to see with low risk. What do we do with that information? How do we make tier 1 more robust? There is no one size fits all answer to that question. And oftentimes you sort of have to look deeper into your data to start getting some ideas. However, there's a really good starting point for this question that a lot of schools have. And the starting point oftentimes is empowering teachers with low intensity supports. So let's dig into a little bit of what that means. When we're looking at the tier one experience for all students and looking at our data and finding, I feel like tier one is not quite meeting the needs of enough students right now. We kind of have to take a step back and say, okay, how is the school environment functioning to support our students? Is there anything that we can do sort of broadly or structurally or in the classroom that's going to make quick shifts that can impact those risk levels? This slide talks about essential components of classroom management, and it divides it up into four components: making a positive classroom climate, the actual physical arrangement of the room, routines and procedures, and things like managing paperwork within the classroom. These are sort of four domains that oftentimes can predict how a classroom is managed, whether it be managed well or maybe not managed quite as well as you might like. One of my colleagues is going to put in the chat a link to a book that actually is a super helpful resource if you're kind of looking at structurally, like how is our classroom management going at the school level or kind of within individual classrooms. We call it the Brown book sometimes, but it kind of breaks down these four big areas and gives really good guidance for like, how do you set up your physical environment in the classroom to be successful? Because sometimes you'll walk into a room and it's like very cluttered. There's a lot of things against the wall. It's tight. It's hard to walk through. And then you start watching how students actually interact in the physical environment. They're bumping into each other. They're having a hard time getting from point A to point B. And suddenly like bumping into a peer turns into a confrontation or an escalated behavior on one of their parts. And you start looking at that and saying, okay, could we actually prevent that behavior, not by focusing on the student behavior, but rather by focusing on how we can change the physical environment to be more suitable to prevent those kinds of problems from occurring? Or looking at like routines and procedures in the classroom and saying, okay, if we're having a lot of trouble during transitions, can we do something to make the procedure of the transition more smooth in terms of how we're dismissing students or how we're teaching students to listen for directions when directions are given? These are sort of like big picture ideas, but they're a really good starting point for saying, okay, if we need to think about our classroom management because we have all this behavioral risk, let's start with the basics. These are the basics. And that Brown book is a really good place to kind of dig way into the nitty gritty of each of those four domains. That's one starting point. Another good starting point is thinking about something that we call low intensity supports. So these are things like behavior specific praise, pre-correction, active supervision, instructional choice, increased opportunities to respond. These are just 5 of 7 low intensity supports. I'll show you a slide in a few minutes that has all of them listed. But when we think about these supports, the important thing is to know is that these are really probably already part of your tier 1 plan anyways. If you were to look at any school's Ci3T implementation manual, you'd be very likely to find these as part of the faculty and staff responsibilities, is know what these strategies are and how to use them generally. However, when we're starting to think about what tier 1 looks like and how to intensify it, by getting really, really good at using these strategies, and not just 1 or 2 of them, but knowing how to use them all in an integrated fashion, can really make an enormous difference in how a classroom functions. Because these teacher behaviors, and again, emphasizing these are behaviors that the teacher can change that actually then result in behavioral outcomes or behavioral changes for students, is a really, really good first line way that we can start addressing those higher levels of risk by increasing structure and supervision and reinforcement in the classroom. And so if your school is starting to think about, hey, like we've got a lot of risk, what can we do about that? One way that we recommend addressing this is by creating on-site expertise in these strategies and then providing supports to each other as colleagues for using these strategies in the classroom. So some resources that exist, for example, is a little like self-rating for knowledge, confidence, and usefulness for different classroom management strategies. And what you can do is start getting people who are really, really good at one of these techniques and having them provide coaching, support, and feedback to other colleagues to help them take what one person knows and apply it in many different classrooms. So for example, if you know someone that's really good at giving behavior specific praise and you know this because you've seen them do it, how cool would it be to connect that teacher to a teacher who's really struggling to be like, hey, this one little trick that you can use in the classroom by doing this, this, and this can make a huge impact just by this little shift. And having that point of connection can really make a powerful impact for those initial responses to tier 1 difficulties. So if you had a class that might have data that looks like this is kind of a quick little way of summarizing one class's data, is to show like risk levels in reading and math and behavior and office discipline referrals. When we start looking at class data in this fashion, we can think about how academic and behavioral risk are combining and oftentimes interacting with each other that are causing some of these difficulties. which we mentioned earlier during the slide that kind of talks about how beginning of the year risk and externalizing behaviors, for example, often predicts lower academic achievement at the end of the year. So if you're looking at class data and saying, okay, where do I even start? Because we're having behavior problems and academic problems. These low intensity supports are a really great entry point because we refer to them as a technique that's going to increase engagement and reduce disruptive behavior. Because when you really think about what does it mean for students to be engaged, oftentimes it's hard to be engaged and disruptive at the same time. They're sort of incompatible behaviors. So instead of just thinking about like, how can I make my students follow the rules? How can I make them stop shouting out? How can I make them stop pushing and shoving each other or bothering each other during instruction? Instead, if we say, okay, how can I make my students more engaged in my instruction? It helps us kind of flip the script a little bit and think about, okay, what can I do to change my behavior a little bit that's going to help my students be more successful? And by being more successful, it's going to give them fewer opportunities to engage in those challenging behaviors. And those low intensity supports, again, are a great technique for doing that. Okay, so I promised that I would show a full slide with a list of the resources. I'm sorry, a list of the interventions, the low intensity strategies and resources that you might use to learn more about them and to develop on-site expertise in your school. So if you were to go to ci3t.org and access the professional learning tab and scroll down on that page, you'll eventually find this thing that we call the blue accordions. And this set of resources gives not just low intensity supports, but also some tier 2 and tier 3 interventions as well. But the low intensity strategies are active supervision, behavior specific praise, high probability request sequences, instructional choice, instructional feedback, opportunities to respond, and pre-correction. And for each of these strategies and all the other strategies listed on this page, you find that there are a host of resources that you can use to learn about how to use this intervention, including step-by-step checklists for learning the actual steps involved in implementing this to support students, as well as other things like treatment integrity and social validity forms, which give kind of an opportunity for you to see like, how am I doing with implementing this strategy, and do the students actually like when I do this to support their needs. The low intensity supports also have like quick little overview videos that kind of give you a preview of what the strategy is and why it's useful. And all of these resources are free to use. So if you're someone that's working at a school where you're thinking, I need to learn how to do these strategies better, this is a great starting point. Or if you're at a school where you're thinking, we need to build on-site capacity to implement these and support each other in implementing these resources are a really, really good place to start. You'll also find, if you're interested in sharing some of these ideas with parents, so for example, if you're working with some parents who are trying to collaborate with you to support students in being successful at home and at school, we also have little translations that turn these low intensity supports into things that we can give to parents as well. So we have little step-by-step checklists and infographics that are parent-friendly that show how these strategies can be used at home for parents that are looking for some resources to support their child as well. And those are actually found on the ci3t.org/COVID page. They were developed by our team in response to people doing remote learning and knowing that parents at that time were both trying to manage, like, how do I keep my kids engaged in instruction and support their behavioral needs while they're at home way more than they were before. And we had a lot of positive feedback where teachers felt like, and parents felt like, having these strategies at their disposal really helped them to help their students and children be successful at home. And Rebecca mentioned this earlier, the integrated lesson plan form, which, as Rebecca mentioned, I think this is really important to tell or to repeat. The integrated lesson plan is not intended to be something that teachers make for every single lesson they ever give. Really what it's supposed to do is give us a structured way of thinking about lessons and how we can put into the lesson all of those low intensity supports, like strategically, like, when should I give pre-correction during my lesson? And when should I use active supervision and behavior specific praise, et cetera? Because there's a notion that, oh, I'm doing my teaching now I'm going to stop teaching and do my behavioral support, and then I'm going to go back to teaching. When in reality, these strategies are made to be woven into the fabric of instruction, so we can actually give behavior specific praise as part of our process for giving feedback to students. And starting to realize how those strategies can be actually like a part of the instructional routines makes them all the more powerful, because that just means that we can use them more frequently to support student engagement. So really, this is kind of a nice thought exercise to be like, okay, during the flow of my instruction, when's a good time for me to embed those strategies, and what might that look like? And of course, we mentioned that building on-site expertise is a really good idea. And if you actually can kind of work with colleagues to make a list of like who's really good at which strategy, and just having this list so that when people are like, oof, I need some help with my instruction, my tier one isn't looking quite the way I want it to, who can I go to for help? I want to know how to increase my opportunities to respond, or I want to know how to use behavior specific praise more effectively. There generally is no better coach than a colleague that's trusted and that you already have a relationship with, because you can go to that person and seek support if they're an expert in that content or that strategy. So you might kind of think about making connections or helping make connections between your colleagues and other folks that are maybe struggling in your school to figure out who can we connect with to help them. And then in the last block, we want to get into sort of the the meat of what people usually think about when they think about using screening data. So the classic use of behavior screening data or academic data screening data is actually connecting students to tier 2 and tier 3 supports. So when we think about behavior data specifically, where do we go to figure out what tier 2 and tier 3 interventions are available? The answer to that question, if you're in a school that's implementing Ci3T, is you should have a section in your manual, in your school's Ci3T manual, that's called the secondary tier 2 intervention grids. And what that might look like is a series of rows in a table that's going to list out every single intervention that's available in your school. It's going to consist of not just behavior interventions, but also academic interventions, social and emotional interventions, and often cases, interventions that might actually target multiple domains at the same time. So I'm going to talk through in a few minutes how those grids actually work. But it's important to first consider that those even exist, because oftentimes it sort of happens way down in this really long document. It's easy to lose sight that this exists. And so when people go to look at their data and like, oh my gosh, I have, 5 kids that I really want to do tier 2 work with in my class. And they're like, what am I going to do? Oh, I'll go to Teachers Pay Teachers, or they start Googling things on the internet, when you actually want to start with what's in your manual, because these are supported, almost always research-based or evidence-based tier 2 interventions. So we want to start with what we know works, instead of going out into kind of the who knows what's out there, wild west of Google searching behavior interventions. You never know what you're going to get. So definitely keep in mind those intervention grids, and I'll actually talk through how to use those here in just a minute. Now, up next, this picture. If I was Kathleen, I would now tell you a story about CrossFit and how her experience in CrossFit is a metaphor for tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. I'm not going to try to do that because I'm not Kathleen. So instead, I'm just going to give you some big picture ideas about what tier 2 is and what tier 2 is not. So there is a conception that tier 2 interventions, by definition, are things that you send kids from your class out to an interventionist to receive in a small group in the hallway or in somebody's office or something like that. There's also a conception that there are tier 2 kids in our schools, the kids that get tier 2 supports, and we call them tier 2 kids. I want to address both of those misconceptions for just a minute. I want to start with the language issue. So we want to try to avoid using this language of tier 2 kids, tier 3 kids, tier 1 kids, because it's putting a label on people that actually is not terribly helpful and oftentimes actually inaccurate when you really step back to think about it. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, when you think about people as complex beings, we have different needs, different strengths, different weaknesses. Oftentimes you'll have students that have real strengths in academics, but real concerns in internalizing behaviors. These are kids that are anxious because they're overachievers, or they're overachievers and they're anxious. It doesn't make sense to label them as a tier 2 kid or tier 3 kid, obviously, because they're excelling in so many ways, but they have these other needs. We want to make sure that we're saying this child has tier 1 needs in academics because they're really succeeding, but maybe tier 2 or tier 3 needs in terms of those internalizing behaviors. That makes sense, but we want to apply the same logic to those kids that are maybe having substantial acting out problems in the classroom. There is a temptation to label them as a behavior problem or a high flyer or a tier 3 student. We really want to take a step back from that and look across their skills, their strengths, their weaknesses, and say, hey, this is a child that has tier 3 needs in the area of behavior. What can we do to address those needs? Because the tiers are meant to address needs, not label or bucket kids or track kids. And the way that we use language around tiered interventions, it actually reflects how we think about it. but we can also change the way we talk about it, which is going to change the way we think about it too. So definitely we encourage you to think about the way that we're talking about students' needs, and always frame them from the view of, this is a child with tier 2 needs in this area or tier 1 needs in this area, and move forward accordingly. And when you're working with colleagues, modeling that approach to describing needs, because it really does reflect a more nuanced way of thinking about meeting the child's needs in a holistic fashion. And then moving back one further step, where I mentioned, there's this misconception that tier 2 interventions happen someplace else that's not the classroom. They go to their check-in, check-out mentor. They go to reading group intervention. They go to the counselor's office. All of those things are for sure examples of tier 2 interventions or tier 3 interventions. However, it's just absolutely critical to consider that any tier 2 intervention that might be happening outside the classroom needs to have a connection to what's happening inside the classroom too. Because what we know through years of research on different kinds of interventions, like social skill interventions, is that you can teach a kid to use a social skill in the counselor's office. But if you don't intentionally do a lot of work to help that skill transfer to the classroom or transfer to the playground, it's not going to make any difference, or it's not going to make as much difference as it could, because it's called generalization. We have to figure out how to help kids take what they're learning in this not naturalistic, not real context, this kind of closed environment of that interventionist situation or office, and help them how to figure out how to use that in the real world. That is the work. And so we want to make sure that when we're working with kids that have tier 2 needs, we're not conceptualizing this as hey, that's the counselors doing this in the counselor's office, and they're going to come back to my room and they're going to have these skills and they're going to get better. We actually need to collaborate with our colleagues to make sure we know what's being taught in the counselor's office, know what's being taught in the reading interventionist office, and find ways to help prompt the students to use those skills in our classrooms, on the playground, et cetera. Because that is how we're going to actually make this stuff stick and generalize into multiple settings and actually make the difference that we're hoping to achieve. Also, there are tier 2 interventions that we can use in the classroom without the assistance of any separate interventionist. And I'm going to talk for a minute in just a little bit about those low intensity strategies like active supervision and behavior specific praise, and give you an example for how that actually can become a tier 2 intervention if we focus on that strategy and make it individualized for the student's needs, or it can be a component of a tier 2 intervention. So it's good to know that just because we're saying, hey, this kiddo has some tier 2 needs in behavior, we don't need to rely on an external interventionist in every situation. A lot of times we can actually figure out how to make a little package of interventions that can be done just by me, the classroom teacher, without adding a whole lot of extra burden to my preps or my planning. I don't need to print off a whole bunch of extra stuff or do a whole bunch of additional things to actually turn a tier 2 or turn a tier 1 practice into a tier 2 intervention. So we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Okay. So sorry, that was a bit of a expanded description. We'll try to get that to feel practical here in a few slides. Before we move on to that, I mentioned the tier 2 intervention grid. What you're looking at now is an example of those grids. And I'm going to describe what you're actually looking at here. So you have an idea for when you look at this in your school's manual, you'll have an idea for what to do with it. So on the left, you'll find an actual just name of the intervention. So this is a self-monitoring intervention. And then you'll find a description. And when we work with teams to put these grids together, we encourage them to think about this as a description of who's doing what, for whom, and where, or under what conditions. So basically thinking about, what is this? Give me some overview of the intervention and what that might look like in practice. And it's helpful to remember that, self-monitoring is not something that needs to be done by a separate interventionist. Self-monitoring is actually something that can be done in the classroom as well. So that description is going to be there to kind of get us started. Oftentimes you'll find hyperlinks to resources in the descriptions. So maybe this is just the Cliff Notes version, but maybe it connects to the self-monitoring resources on ci3t.org that you were just looking at in the last breakout room. Okay, so that's all well and good. The description probably looks pretty familiar, but then you get to this school-wide data entry criteria. What does that mean? This is going to give you a starting place for figuring out when you're looking at your class-wide data and you're saying, okay, I've got this group of kids that have moderate risk for externalizing behavior, and they're really struggling in academics. They're not turning their work in, or they're failing a course. So we kind of are looking at this sort of description of a group of kids that are having maybe combined difficulties in academics and behavior. By looking at the entry criteria for interventions, we can start matching interventions to students based on those school-wide data. So this self-monitoring intervention might be appropriate for students who have behavior concerns in externalizing behaviors, or have multiple discipline referrals, or have academic challenges. So we can kind of use this as a jumping off point for connecting the intervention to the student or the student to the intervention. And then whenever we're doing tier 2 work, we want to make sure that we have some idea for how to monitor whether that intervention is actually working for the student. So each of the grids is going to have some description of progress monitoring data for student outcomes, as well as collecting data on social validity and treatment integrity. And social validity is basically saying, hey, before we start this intervention, let's ask the student what they think about it. Do they think it's going to help them? Is there anything we can change about the intervention to make it feel like it's not embarrassing to them or inconvenient for them? Because if it's embarrassing or inconvenient, they're not going to want to do it and they're not going to benefit from it. So asking some social validity questions up front, super helpful. And then with any intervention, we can't decide whether it's working or not if we don't actually know how well it's being implemented. So treatment integrity is a really simple data collection procedure where we just fill out a little checklist that says, hey, today I implemented 5 out of the 6 components of my self-monitoring plan with fidelity. Good job, me. Or, hey, I forgot to do like half of the components today because I was really busy. Tomorrow I'll do better. That treatment integrity checklists are super helpful. And if you were looking at the PL page, the professional learning page in that last breakout room, you might have actually seen that a lot of the strategies listed there have downloadable treatment integrity checklists. So it's not something you have to make. It's just something you download and set up for you to collect on a regular basis. And then lastly, we've got exit criteria. The idea being that we don't want to keep kids in tier 2 interventions forever, because that's not really going to be very helpful. We want to make sure we're making progress and have some plan to exit them from this support eventually. We don't want kids to be reliant or like dependent on getting interventions all the time if they don't need them. So we want to have an idea for like, hey, when we get to this level, we're going to try to fade this support back a little bit. So in this particular intervention, you might look at screening data, and once students start screening into the low range, we might think about how to fade that support so that it's not something that they need to have as consistently or every day in their classroom. So that was the self-monitoring intervention. You might have similar rows for academic supports as well. So this is an example of a small group reading instruction intervention that actually adds on a self-monitoring component. So this is a great example of how academic and behavioral interventions can be combined to address some of the needs of kids that have those dual concerns. Because we know that behavior can impact academic performance, and we know that academic performance sometimes impacts behavior. We want to make sure that we're trying to tackle those two things together. So if we have kids that are having moderate or high levels of risk on externalizing behaviors, and they're struggling in academics, before we just start throwing them into reading groups or throwing them into check in, check out, we might think about, okay, if we're going to do a reading group for this kiddo, what can we do as a behavioral support that's part of the reading group experience to make sure that we're setting them up for success to get the most out of that intervention that they can, and addressing both of those needs in an integrated fashion. So we can kind of give you an example of what this might look like. Here's a class where we've got a handful of kids that are demonstrating pretty high risk on academic reading screening measures, and also showing some levels of risk on the externalizing subscale of the SRSS. So the teacher's going to look at these class data and say, okay, I don't want to just do a reading group intervention for these kids because they do have those behavioral concerns. So how can we modify my reading group to include self-monitoring procedures? What that might look like is they would go to the ci3t.org/PL tab of the website. They would download the self-monitoring materials that exist there, which include a great step-by-step guide for how to install self-monitoring into any academic context. It also has templated self-monitoring forms that look like this. And basically, it's going to give the students a series of prompts for them to monitor their own behavior. So the student is taught how to use this checklist, and they're taught how to mark when they think about their behavior. Did they come to the table when called? Did they read their book at the table? Did they build words or practice sounds with the tiles? And these steps are basically modeled off of or building off of the actual steps of the reading group. And then there's like a little component at the end where if the student self-monitors and finds that, hey, I did most of those things today, then they get some sort of reinforcer. So in this case, they're getting a PBIS ticket if they met 5 out of 6 of those behaviors. And in this case, it's actually super cool because they can get a bonus ticket if their ratings match the teacher's ratings. So what you can do is actually, if a student really struggles during reading group, and then they say, I didn't do this, they self-monitor their behavior and say, I didn't actually come to group when called, or I didn't follow directions, and the teacher agrees with them, it gives you an opportunity to reinforce the behavior of honestly reporting and reflecting on one's behavior, which is actually really impactful. Because if students can get to a place where they're taking responsibility for their actions and acknowledging when they're maybe not quite meeting expectations, you can build off of that, even as a starting point. So that's an example of how that self-monitoring intervention could be built into the fabric of a reading intervention, so that you're kind of getting a double dose of both behavioral support and academic support. And as I mentioned before, when we're thinking about whether or not that intervention worked, we want to make sure we're collecting some treatment integrity data. So this is like the teacher rating whether or not they've implemented all of the procedures that are necessary for that intervention to work. And again, it kind of is actually like a self-monitoring form for the teacher to keep track of, like, hey, I did a really good job in implementing this support for the student today, or hey, I missed a few, I can do better next time. Here's another example of a possible tier 2 intervention. This is an example that actually is kind of that classic tier 2 support where you have students going out to the counselor's office, for example. This is an example using something called the Social Skills Improvement System, which is a really handy book where basically you fill out some rating scales to figure out what specific social skills a student struggles to do currently. And then the rating scales tell you, hey, these are the lessons that you should teach the child to help them build those skills. So you can see, like, these are kids that might have moderate externalizing or internalizing scores. They don't have very many absences, because you don't want to often do like pull-out groups for kids that miss a lot of school, because they haven't really had experience with tier 1 instruction yet, and they're not going to benefit from a tier 2 support if they're not actually attending school. So oftentimes you want to try to take care of the attendance concerns first. So yeah, you might find those kids and then work with the counselor to create groups of kids that have similar types of social skill challenges, and then to provide those kinds of lessons as a pull-out experience. And then another kind of potential tier 2 support might actually be taking those low intensity supports that we talked about before and considering how we can intensify them and combine them to make little mini behavior plans for students. So you might think about a kid that has lots of trouble during transitions. So you might be using active supervision and pre-correction for the whole class, but you might actually start giving individualized prompts to that child. Before transitions happen, you're going to prompt them to follow the expectations, and you're going to give that in a really positive fashion and get them ready to make the transition in a good way. And then you're going to actively supervise the process of that transition. So we're kind of using these low intensity supports in a really specific and individualized fashion for that child to support whatever maybe behavioral target or difficulties that they're having. And this is an example of how getting really good at using low intensity supports has many benefits. One of which is that if you're really good at using it for the whole class, you set yourself up to be able to use it as an intervention really effectively for individual students that are struggling. And by combining them in really strategic ways, you kind of have a lot of components of interventions that you can start plugging in there for students who might need those supports. And again, you can think about academic interventions and how they might be featured in your Ci3T plan. So at the middle school level, you might have things like Read 180, where you have like specific courses that are set up for students who might be struggling with academic skills. Oftentimes schools will have like mentoring programs, and thinking about how those mentoring programs can serve an intervention need, just to give some additional adult attention or peer attention to students who are having difficulties is a really, really powerful potential technique. So we've got mentoring programs, and then also thinking about math programs as well. So you want to make sure that all of your academic domains are represented, and you have interventions that could be used for difficulties that might come up in those areas. And then for tier 3, which will be sort of the last piece that we're focused on here tonight, these are our kids that have pretty intensive needs. And again, since we're thinking about behavior screening, these are going to be kids that are screening in the high risk level for internalizing and externalizing behavior. When this is happening, hopefully there are interventions that have been put in place before you get to this point, but sometimes students will move in and you start saying, oh my goodness, this is a new student for us. We're really concerned. you're lucky enough to have screening data for them and it comes back high. So sometimes there's a tendency to say, okay, we've got to do tier 2 first. We got to do tier 2 for 12 weeks, see if it works. And then if it's not working, then we'll go to tier 3. But sometimes you have data that's like, okay, this is a major concern. What can we do to address the student's needs right now? Or maybe you've got a kid that's been struggling for a long time and they continue to screen in at moderate or high risk. And you're saying we need a really good intervention for these students. And oftentimes our recommendation generally is that a functional assessment-based intervention is a really, really good bet for creating a behavior intervention plan that's individualized for students' needs. The title of this slide says for middle and high school students, but I don't want to give you the impression that functional assessment-based interventions are only for high school students. They are very much appropriate and evidence-based for students across the grade span. So the context here is that a functional assessment-based intervention is something that you're probably not going to do alone as a classroom teacher. You're probably going to be working in connection with school psychologists or potentially a special education teacher to kind of support this process. It's probably something that you're going to be communicating with parents about to get some permission to collect additional data. And you're going to be creating an individualized behavior plan that's going to be collaborative in nature because you're working with multiple people to collect data to figure out, okay, this behavior happens under these circumstances, and these are the potential reinforcing consequences that are making that behavior happen more often. How can we change the environment, or what skills can we teach the student that's going to change the environment or change the student's abilities so that they can go about behaving in a different way that's going to be more socially acceptable and help them be more successful at school. So I'm not going to teach you how to do a functional assessment-based intervention. We call them a FABI tonight because there's too much information there to cover in this short period of time. However, we do have a section on our website, which I'll show you in just a minute. It's called FABI. We call it the FABI tab. And it gives you basically a really comprehensive step-by-step process for developing these interventions. And just as an example, there's a special issue of Beyond Behavior. And if you're ever interested in seeing some of these articles, if you email me or email Grant Allen, if you're interested in getting some of these articles, we can connect you with them. They're basically case studies of how multidisciplinary teams work together to create really, really powerful intervention plans for students that demonstrated high levels of risk in areas of externalizing behavior. That actually produced like substantial behavior change for these students. And they're a really good illustration of what the FABI process looks like. So we definitely recommend if you're at a school where you're thinking, hey, we've got a couple kids that have pretty significant behavior needs and we're struggling to figure out what do we do for these kids? Definitely check out this functional assessment-based interventions tab on the Ci3T website because it really does provide an excellent intervention approach to create that individualized behavior intervention plan that student might need. And this website does provide basically a step-by-step process from start to finish to help you work through that process as well.
A few different things that we just wanted to point out on this. And one are these protocols that we have for systematic screening. There's one that's specifically geared towards like district level folks who are getting ready to set up screening in their district or in a school. And you can download the document and you can edit it as you go through to check boxes off, to add in dates, to make notes of things. But it walks you through all of the like big logistics that you would need to think through before you start screening. So what needs to happen a couple months before, the day before, what are the big rocks that need to get taken care of for systematic screening to get up and running in your school or district. And then the second one is a site level screening protocol. And that kind of walks you through the logistics of what needs to happen the day of screening. So different tips that teachers might consider before they sit down to rate for the first time, considerations like that. And again, you can download this document and you can edit it to make notes or fit the needs of the context that you're in. So those are some things you might check out. Mark mentioned this screening coordinator training manual. This is another thing available on the screening tab on the website. You can download a PDF version of this if you just want to store it and read it, highlight, make notes, but you can also access a browser-based ebook version of it, which is kind of fun. It looks like an actual book and the pages flip. So if you want to read it that way, that's another option too. But this walks you through all of the things that you would need to know in order to implement the SRSS-IE in the school or district. So from getting things set up all the way through taking that data once screening is done and using it to inform instruction or some of the different things that we talked about tonight. So this might be something that you check out. There's information about the cut scores, which I know Mark gave us a nice overview of tonight. Another thing to remember is that these resources available on our website are freely available for you to share. So if you know someone who's interested in screening, you can send this to them, or you yourself can take it and share it as you please. There are also some resources available on pbis.org around screening. When you go to that website, along the top, I'm not quite as fancy as Mark, so I think you can see my cursor maybe instead of a nice little light bar. But along the top, there are all those options. And under topics, if you select database decision making, that's where the majority of resources about screening are housed. And so a couple of them just to highlight, some walk you through selecting a tool. So if you're in a process where you're still learning about what behavior screeners are out there to decide which one you want to use, you might check that out. There's resources about using systematic screening where we got information from people who've been doing this for years to give kind of like tips and overviews and things to consider. And then kind of in line with a conversation we had earlier in our first breakout room about communicating this information with your community, there's a practice brief on that as well, where it kind of gives you things to consider about how you might go about doing that with keeping confidentiality in mind and all those big kind of things that you process through as you're figuring out how to share that information.